especially lucky today to have Sirje Kiin here to speak about a political autobiography, independent political action in the 20th century Estonia. I've heard her speak before, and I always find her very interesting to listen to. And so I hope you'll welcome her now and enjoy what she has to tell us today. So thank you.
Thank you for giving me opportunity to share admiration of Benjamin Franklin today. And this will be a story of Estonian re-independency and my personal part in it, how I experienced my country to become free again. So just to remind you, most of you probably know, Estonia is situated in North Europe, East Russia, South Latvia and Lithuania, other Baltic states. West, you can't see on this map, is Sweden over the Baltic Sea, and North, Finland. It's a very tiny country, only 1/3 of territorium of South Dakota, but 1.3 million people. So small nation, but very much loving freedom as you do here in big countries. Brief overview of 20th century history in Estonia, which has been very dramatic and violent. First, we fought 2 years, 1918-20, for our independence in a war with Russia. And Lenin finally, 1920, signed a peace agreement forever, not to occupy Estonia again. And Estonia became free republic. 1918. We celebrate 24th of February as our Independence Day, despite the war went on 2 more years. It was golden times for Estonia, but the 1930s European political situation started dramatically to change, and 1939 was made a pact called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Hitler and Stalin to invade part of Europe by Soviet Union, and they, according to this pact, Soviets invaded Estonia in June 1940, and Estonia was forced to join Soviet Union. Then Second World War started. Soviets were driven out very quickly by Germans, 1941. Then followed 3 years German occupation, which was much less violent, much less victims for us than Soviet occupation. First year, 1940-41. And then 1944, as you well know, Hitler started to lose power in World War II, and Germans were driven out 1944 fall. Estonians fought 2 summer months, July and August, to get Estonia free again against Red Army. During these 2 months, it made possible that 100,000 Estonians could escape to free West during those very deadly fights in Blue Mountains, east part of Estonia. There were about 10,000 Estonians killed in those fights, but about 50,000 Russian army people killed. So balance was like 1 to 5 for us, but despite that we lost our battle and occupation started. What did it mean, all this almost half-century occupation? Very briefly, it was a closed totalitarian society, society of fear. There was no freedom of speech, only central state newspapers, no freedom of business, only nationalized state ownership, no traveling abroad. You could travel all over Soviet Union. This was very welcome because they wanted to mix all nations in Soviet Union. but no abroad, only you needed to sign exceptional cases to go abroad. You needed to report to KGB afterwards all about your contacts and things, so it was very exceptional to travel abroad. Most of Russians didn't even have passports to travel abroad. Estonians still had their own passports. I have this Soviet Union passport. If nobody has not seen here, I have kept it as a historical document for you. They, of course, didn't allow our own passports. Our flag, blue, black, white was forbidden. All our cultural and religious history was forbidden. About 1 million books were destroyed, burned, and we couldn't even keep any poetry books of those writers who escaped to free world. It was a threat to get fired or to sent to a prison. In agricultural country as Estonia was, collectivization was also very violational process. It meant that all private farmers, which were very successful in 1920s and 30s, needed to give all their cows and horses and everything they owned to kolkhozes and sovkhozes, and to own nothing, only be a simple labor of those collectivizated kolkhozes. Russification hurt very much our literature and culture. We could still have education in Estonian, even in higher educational level, but in many other Soviet Union republics it wasn't possible, especially in Middle Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, other countries. They even forbid their own alphabets. They were forced to use Kirillitsa, Slavic alphabet. We saved our own alphabet, Latin alphabet, but we felt like language was our castle, and language somehow helped us to survive until we got freedom again. Few words I wanted to tell you also about mass deportations, what they actually were. Deportation, as you know, is a crime against humanity, and during those Soviet first years, about 30,000 Estonians were taken overnight from their homes, packed only 1 or 2 luggages and sent to Siberia. Men were arrested and separated from families. Most of them died. Families were put to animal wagons and sent without food and water to Siberia in week-long train trips. Most of those people also died, especially little children. Family members couldn't return home country after they were liberated from those deported years. They could live around other republics, not even the same state. Just to know from one person's story what this all meant, I want to tell you a story of Silvia Uusväli, my friend. She is 80 today, but she was 19 years old, 1949. 9 of her relatives were sent to Siberia and arrested and in labor camps in Siberia. She wrote a letter to her aunt who was in labor camp in Russia and added Under's poem. Maria Under, our poet who emigrated to Sweden, who had written 1941 a poem, Christmas Greeting 1941. You have this text with your papers to memorize and to compassionate those who were deported. This is dedicated to those people. And she was a young girl, wanted to comfort her aunt and sent this letter with this poem to to this labor camp. This letter never arrived, but about half a year later, two men came and arrested young girl. She was sent 20, and she was sent for 10 years labor camp Siberia herself. After Stalin died 1953, she was suddenly released, and then she saw her files, and then she realized that the Under's poem was the reason why she was accused anti-Soviet activities and sent to the prison. She never got to work as accountant as she was educated. She could only get as a former political prisoner regular labor work in cable factory. But then a little bit more tourism started to come to Estonia 1970s. There were Khrushchev times, a little bit so-called melting times, and one tourist from Sweden came and gave her, Sylvia, a little package, and it was a gift from Maria Under, a little silver sword to thank and to compassionate her for suffering for her poem. And when I presented this winter my large Under biography in Estonia, Sylvia was there with me, and she didn't want to tell her story herself, so I told the story, and she wore proudly this silver sword. So I used this exceptional story of Sylvia to show how this big, strong, so-called strong totalitarian regime could be so afraid of one young girl and one poem. How powerful can a poem actually be? So what kind of forms of resistance we had in Estonia? It's not very well known and studied issue in history. It's just started, but the main forms were violent resistance and non-violent resistance. The main violent fights happened about 7-8 years after World War II. About 30,000 Estonian men, among them my own uncle, who was 19-year-old, Edi, called my mother's brother, went to forest and fought against Soviet sabotaging and killing communist activists, etc. It didn't mean that it was only 30,000, because they all had supportive groups in society, in villages, families who feeded them, who helped them. So actually it was counted more than 130,000 people who actually were involved in this form of fighting. Last forest brother died in a battle of against KGB agencies in 1978, so he was in age 80 and he had been lived in forest 34 years. And he drowned himself because he couldn't escape from KGB agents. Most common was, of course, non-violent resistance, which continued in many forms. One of them was political, active public resistance, and this was very few active dissidents because practically in this closed totalitarian society it wasn't possible. There was few trials, like 2 trials per decade, 2, 3, sometimes 5 people arrested. For what? For collecting information about real situation in Soviet Estonia and sending it to abroad, to Voice of America radio, to Radio Free Europe, to Free Press in West. And there was only actually officially few political prisoners, despite this mass deportation and arresting. They all were actually political prisoners, but they were not officially counted political prisoners. So I want to tell you briefly three stories.